Hi, everyone. Super excited to see you all tonight for the introduction of our newest hire and the most important position we actually hold in this Department of Architecture, which is the Cret Chair Visiting Professor, which is this year and the next 2 years, Mette Ramsgaard. So super happy to have her here. You already all know her from Acadia, of course, where they took the Best Paper Award. I think two paper. Did you take two Best Paper Awards? I think two. You might have taken two. Sort of most awards, and very, very impressive work. So we thought it would be great for everyone to be able to enjoy Mette's work. Groundbreaking. I met Mette many years ago when I took my students to Denmark, as I'd read somewhere that Denmark was the country with the most robotic development. And went there, and then of course actually the highlight of the whole trip, apart from some little seal that was talking to older people, as a robotic seal that was talking to older people, it was meeting Mette and Mette's research group at the Danish Academy. So Mette basically is teaching here this year in the third year MArch. And as I said, she is the professor and the head of CITA, which is the Center for IT and Architecture at the Danish Academy in Copenhagen in Denmark. Her lecture, New Visions, Conceiving Time in a Bio-Based Architecture, will follow in a second. Mette founded the Center for IT and Architecture Research Group in 2005 at the Royal Academy of Fine Arts, School of Architecture, Design and Conservation, where she has piloted a special research focus on new digital material research and relations that digital technologies bring forth. CITA has been the central informing an international research field examining the changes to material practice in architecture. Hence all the times that she has lectures all over Europe and is almost in every possible panel on this subject. This has been led by a series of research investigations developing concepts and technologies, as well as the strategic projects such as the International Marie Curie ITN Network InnoChain and the ERC project Eco-Metabolistic Modeling for Architectural Design. That last one fosters interdisciplinary sharing and dissemination of expertise and supports new collaborations in the field of architecture, engineering, and fabrication. She is currently the general reporter and the head of a science track for the UIA, which is upcoming actually this spring, a World Congress on Sustainable Futures, Leave No One Behind, asking how architecture can contribute to the UN SDGs. In 2022, she is appointed our Cret Chair, as I just mentioned, and taught at the Acadia the biopolymer printing strategies for material grading of bio-based material in our Hybrids and Haycities conference. The workshop examined the composition, printing, sensing, and grading of biopolymers with a focus on robotics, 3D extrusion of the cellulose reinforced biopolymers materials made from material waste. They question how materials are sourced, composed and formed, and how rethinking these axioms can lead to the imaginations of new ways of understanding the ecological context, performance and expression of buildings. Thank you for closing the door. Mette was also the prologue keynote panel for the Acadia conference. That panel was actually moderated by Robert Stuart Smith and was questioning what Hybrids and Haycities actually was. So it's a really interesting panel. She has won the Elite Force Prize in 2016, which is awarded every year to 5 outstanding international league researchers who are making an extraordinary contribution to enhancing research in Denmark. Mette is the ever first architectural researcher to win this fourth prize. She was honored for her pioneering research in the digital design and the manufacture of architecture. She also in 2016 won the Acadia Innovative Academic Program Award of Excellence, which recognizes the Center of Information of Technology and Architecture's pioneering approach to design research and experimental pedagogy in Europe. CITA has established itself as a leader in exploring interdisciplinary projects, integrating novel approaches for advanced computing, digital fabrication, interactive architecture, among others. And of course, as I just mentioned, in 2022, her team also won the Best Paper Award in our latest Acadia. Her exhibits have been in 2019, she was in the Works and Words Biennale by the Royal Academy of Fine Arts in Copenhagen, which presented artistic research within the field of architecture in Europe. And artistic research aimed at developing new grounds in architecture and characterized by combining the making of works with reflections in words. And what is not actually, I think, in her bio yet, but is an amazing installation which she just finished at AIDIS Berlin. For who doesn't know this, AIDIS is actually one of the last major architecture galleries / museums in the world, and is really, really important. Its director, Christine Feyerhuis, is incredibly important in the world of architecture, connected to the Prix de Rome, the Pritzker Prize, all kinds of other things. So if you don't know and you haven't been, you have to go to the AIDIS gallery, and hopefully Mette's group's exhibit is still there. And then the recent publication is CITA Complex Modeling, published in 2020, investigates the infrastructures of architectural design modules, conveys the findings of complex modeling research project of a 5-year project supported by the Independent Research Fund in Denmark, undertaken at CITA. The complex modeling asks how new interdisciplinary methods for adaptive parameterization, advanced simulation, machine learning, and robotic fabrication can be orchestrated within novel workflows that expand the agency of architecture, which is essentially what she's doing every day. So I would like to welcome Mette. I'm so happy you can be here with us. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Winke. It's a very humbling introduction. I'm super happy to be here. I'm very, very pleased to be part of our new collegiate. It's a real pleasure for me to have an opportunity to show a broader framework of what we're doing. So I'm going to show some projects, but I will also, I thought I would show very different kinds of scales of projects, trying to link how the very, very small investigation can lead to something that, you know, how scale of project is not necessarily the scale of outcome. And then I also wanted to introduce some of the sort of foundational thinking that we are involved with, that's forming our practice, but also to consider my sort of new path into sustainability and how it's changing my outlook on architecture. So yeah, so I think maybe this is more Winke's height than mine. So I am the head of CITA. I'm very new here in this school, but I came to Copenhagen about 18 years ago after doing my PhD in UK at the Bartlett. So CITA has been many things over a long period, and most importantly, CITA has been a lot of different people that has been contributing to these projects. So we look at robotic fabrication, new material processes, big data and machine learning, extended reality, and the emergent feedback loops that are happening between the way that we can represent, we can model, we can sense, we can fabricate, and we can steer our buildings. We look at digital practice as something which is a ground research question, asking really where or what architecture can be. I think the foundational moment in that is to try to understand the relationship between how something is calibrated and calculated and the link to fabrication. So in the traditional understanding of architecture, we have a representational realm, and it is interpreted by the mason, the builder, and becomes the material expression. What happens with digitization is that new bridges between representation and fabrication are happening, and that fundamentally changes what architecture can be. And beyond that, also there's new encoded depth, that rather than drawing every moment of the line with the pencil, we are calculating it, and with that calculation comes a completely different Boolean logic to what modeling or what representation can be. We are often presented computation as a relatively benign and perhaps also slightly boring extension of an existing realm. We see computation as simply optimization. We can do things quicker, faster, cheaper, better with computers. But of course, what we and many of our international colleagues are really about is trying to understand that there is so much more at stake when we really deep dive into what computational logics brings to architecture. And then I'm also an educator. I think we all are in this space. We're all within the educational realm. And I think computation, but obviously also not only in architecture, but in our society, really is challenging what kind of future we're educating for. So maybe not even when I was educated, maybe never, but maybe there was an idea once that there was a master. The master knew what the reality of architecture should be, and we could follow into the master's footsteps. Then I think it is a much more fluid situation, and we need to ready our students, our colleagues in 5 minutes to be very agile and to be very, uncertain about what it is, what the world that we are building for, and what their role in that world will be. So we need to not teach skills, but teach a curiosity towards skills, and asking what could become a foundational architecture skill. What is the evolving role of the architect? Are we designers? Are we machinists? Are we simulationists? Are we something that is able to bridge many different kinds of knowledge fields? And also, what kinds of questions are architectural? So what kind of new boundaries for our practice are emerging, and how do we engage with them? What are the methodological principles or methodological developments that we need to engage with to be able to ask and answer new kinds of questions? So I find that super inspiring, because it means that we're living on a rock that's always moving, and I think that's just so fundamental to the way that architectural knowledge is produced. So I thought what would be interesting to ask together today now to talk about is the thing that I'm always asking myself about. So what is the challenges to the research agendas of computational design? I'm definitely a computational designer. It's a big field. We're many people inside of it. It's more or less consolidated and has been more or less, or building its sort of structure over the last, I would say, 15 years now. now, it's been the big centers at ETH, University of Stuttgart, and so on have been building over this time. And this is also the time of CITA, so we have definitely been part of that construction of a new field and part of that maturing of this field to be able to actually run larger research grants and to ask more profound questions. What I wanted to focus on is really to think about sustainability and how sustainability challenges maybe a relatively, I would say, a site of optimization. I would think that computational design has sort of found its identity around optimization, and I would like us to go through a little journey that I am on to try to think about how thinking about sustainability maybe challenges, criticizes, destabilizes some of the ground thinking for computational design, asking how we can think about resources and how reconceiving their role in the socio-ecological networks that can result in radical new ways of understanding what architecture is, not just as an object, but also as an object in time. So one of my starting points personally for this kind of movement has been as my role as general reporter, it's called, so the head of the science track in the UIA Congress. It's a world congress. Is held every 3 years. I'm quite sure a lot of you don't know it, but it's actually this very, very large congress in Seoul in 2017. It collected something like 20,000 people. And the UIA is the International Union of Architects. It's an interesting organization. It was made after the Second World War, and it is the sort of interest group that advises the UN. Now, the UN is, of course, the inventors of the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, and so I find this is isometry between being appointed by the UIA, who are the interest group to the UN, working on the theme of the SDGs, really interesting. And our question here is to ask how architecture can participate or can play a particular role in achieving the SDGs. And this can seem like a quite benign question. How do we contribute to the global good of a very humanistic agenda? But it isn't as immediate as we might think. At present, none of the UN SDGs directly articulate architecture or architectural production as a driver for change. And there are no indicators that evaluate its role. It's a little bit. The built environment is included, but from a point of view of urbanism, architecture as a driver for change is not articulated. And it's clear to us that governance, now here global governance, does not truly understand the agency and potential of architecture's role and a contribution. And I think obviously, we need to change that. So a problem statement for the UIA project here, and maybe also for us, could be that that we as architects are very aware of our role in shaping our societies. We understand that we're a fundamental part of the way that we form, the way we live, the way we interact, and the way we build, obviously. But when we look at the SDGs, we can see that architecture is hardly mentioned. So what we want to do is to use the Congress to build awareness, both within and without of architectural practice, of our impact and ability to afford change in the way that we understand and construct the world around us. And I mean, I just absolutely love Virginia and Raphael's work on this. I think it just so showcases the challenges that we make here. So I think the point is that architects are quite aware of the changes that we can afford, but the world around us doesn't really. So we're part of a field where, if we look back to the computational design, we would say, well, the overarching argument for computational design and sustainability has lied with optimization. So the idea is that we can build smarter with less. I mean, this is a very shorthand way of talking about it, but still it does point to the center of the contribution. If we work smarter with less, then we can, and de facto can build lighter, then we can reduce our impact on the environment, on resource, on transport, and on pollution. And so this overarching axiom has informed a breadth of projects, and this both within CITA but also within the field, which examines how computation and automation in its different forms, both in software and in hardware, allows us to work in new ways with traditional materials and work in traditional ways with new materials. One of the remits of this is obviously integrating simulation, integrating advanced simulation into the design models, either driven by big data or through sensing or through generative logics, that we can help us to engage with a whole new degree of material address. And this is, of course, the bridge to digital fabrication, which allows us to functionally grade materials and be very, very careful about how material uses, and to reduce the amount of material that we are working with, to optimize at the micro scale, to be able to work at high, to address the high scale of structural performance. So this idea of the sort of smarter with less, we could also say, is underpinned by a theoretical position, and I use that term very specifically now, but I think it's not a truth, it's a theory that that by formalizing material properties and behaviors and devising means of representation, their inherent complexity, we can access the underlying computational logics and thereby gain agency to their steering. So our, I think, shared in the computational design field, our shared outlook is that we can somehow compute, we can formalize, compute, and steer materials. And this has many different expressions. I don't know if one is better than the other, but it has different kinds of expressions around in different research groups, but they're all guided by optimization. And optimization is obviously also linked to industrialization. So I think the core question of this, if we look to industrialized practice, is we need to really wonder of whether industrialization is the right path, if there are other ways of thinking about how we can work. Can we really optimize ourselves out of the problem? Will these changes be profound enough? Can we define new ways of understanding what building culture can be? And that, of course, brings us back to the SDGs. One of my core activities in the UIA project is I'm co-chairing the panel on rethinking resource together with Carlo Ratti. And there we are really trying to reconsider the sort of circular design paradigm and to introduce that as a way of sharing a more sensitive understanding of how to use a resource. Yeah. Just breathe for a minute here. Yeah, maybe the introduction is a bit long here, but I feel that when we are starting to work with ideas of rethinking resource, of course we need to consider the way we are using resource right now, how it is pressuring the planetary boundaries, and to try to understand, well, how can we reconceive the material basis of our practice? So in 2009, I believe I remember, normally I have it on the slide. Yes, 2009, Rockström wrote this seminal paper on the planetary boundaries, which really outlined the relationship to how we as as a global society are overusing the resources and the resources of our planet. So often when we hear this argument, it is a purely quantitative lamentation. We're running out of sand. It seems that somehow the problem is that there is not enough. But of course, there are huge implications this is not only a resource problem, but it's also a socio-ecological problem as we excavate exponentially more, as illegal mining and other processes of over-extraction are having profound impact on the ecological and social context of which they are part. So in CITA, these kinds of cornerstones of a way of thinking has driven us towards working more with a bio-based material paradigm, to think of the material world as one that we're participating in and co-producing through practices of growing and harvesting, challenging the perception of our surroundings from something inert to something essentially living, and that we are part of these cycles of creating the resources around us. So this embeds a fundamental repositioning of our correlation to the environment. So if sustainability theory teaches us anything, that it is that we are embedded into the natural environment that we are part of, and that the modernist divide between us and nature is an illusion, and instead that we are part and entangled within the world that we are co-constructing. So new discourse is helping us to shape or readdress our gaze, to see other kinds of perspectives, and to understand the realm, the world around us as full, as particles in our air, as ground, as topologies around us, that we are part of them and that we participate in constructing them. I think a really good way of understanding these ideas is through the idea of the human microbiome, which I think is a really interesting model for it. So in my short lifetime, I have still been witness to a shifting of the understanding of the body. Maybe I was not quite part of cybernetics, but still we could go back to someone like Murray and look at sort of early cybernetics, which understand the body as a mechanism. In the era of the invention of computation, we start seeing the body as a code. DNA is a code, and now we understand the body as a subset or a system of interacting bodies that all participate in constructing ourselves. It's said that we are made out of 10 to 100 billion microbial cells. Those numbers swing a lot, but some people say that we are 10 times as many non-human organisms as human inside our bodies. So it's again this idea that we are not outside of nature, we are nature, and how do we construct that? I'll just jump a little bit. So what is the real consequence of sustainability, its history and its theory? How does it challenge the foundations of our practice, and how can we change them? I think these are the core questions that we want to ask, and that ask us to really rethink where it is that we are departing from in constructing architecture. So yeah. So I wanted to show a set of projects. I'll show 3 types of projects and 3 strategies. I wanted to show some of the work that we have been working on within the sort of framework of optimization, designing for and with graded material systems. A project on cascading, working with waste streams, and then a sort of new departure into these bio-based material paradigms. Again, I'm going to show very different scale projects, and just maybe also the pedagogy of understanding that the thing that drives you doesn't necessarily need to be very large scale. in our works around complex modeling, we have been looking at what is an architectural model, what is a representation, and how do we actually think about these extended digital chains that allow us to work from the digital model or from representation across interfacing to fabrication and back again. So how do we create interactive feedback loops between what it means to represent and what it means to make, and how what we're making is unstable and therefore it needs to be recaptured into the digital model. One of the key things that we found here, or the guiding question, was really to understand that we are very, very good at modeling materials at high scale. We're also very, very good at, or structures at high scale. We're also very, very good at understanding materials at low scale, but we have very little understanding of how to actually interface the two and what it means when we are trying to connect low-scale behaviors with high-scale behaviors. So this is a multi-scale modeling exercise, or sort of the principles of multi-scale modeling. In that kind of paradigm, it's very interdisciplinary. Mathematicians, sociologists, loads of people are working with multi-scale modeling. But there you insert a sort of mesoscale, the intermediate scale, as an interface between different scales of behavior. And normally it's an abstraction. So if you're a sociologist or a mathematician, it's an abstraction, this intermediate scale. But for us as architects, it's not an abstraction. It's really something we know very well because it's detailing. And we know that the way that we detail a material can fundamentally change its behavior. So what we were trying to do is trying to understand, well, how do we then interface them, and how can we understand the logics of the models across these different scales and how they impact each other. One of the key concepts here is material grading, and not to think of the industrial framework as creating one standardized material, but that we can, with intent, shape the materials and their performance by grading the way that they're made. So the project I wanted to show this for this is Soirotia. Soirotia we made in 2021. It was a commission by the Center for Media and Arts in Karlsruhe. And it's a very, very large scale for us anyway. We don't do buildings, so very large scale installation. I think it's about 20 meters tall, 20 meters deep, and it goes through these sort of it's an old factory. It goes through these different halls, light halls that it's constructed. It's all made in knits. So I've been working a lot in textiles in CITA. And the interest in knit is both as a material, but also as a model for how we can think about material structures. So here they are sort of membrane structures. We are working with bespoke membranes. I think there's 80 different knitted pieces. They're all different to each other, and they're all made to or mass customized for their specific operation. The structure is animated. It was part of an exhibition called Biomedia, which was about the idea of media being alive and having a nature. What we are interested in is the ability to interface with the underlying knit logic, so this is all knit programming, to be able to steer the material stitch by stitch. And I think knit is super, I mean, I've knitted for 15 years now, so very knit nerd, but it's a really nice scale because it's somehow, it's a little bit, you can look at your stockings or your socks or your t-shirt. It's a little bit under a millimeter scale, can become that fine, but it's not nanoscale. So I've also done projects in nano scale, and for me it becomes so abstract. It's a little bit like working with coatings or paints. Yes, it has a recipe. Yes, it changes its performance, but it's very unintuitive how to operate it. Here, you have the sort of, you can feel it, you can see it, and you can steer the machinery to be able to create highly variegated membranes. fibers. So what we're doing here is we're working with a membrane structure. We need to pre-tension it, and we use the way that we can grade each of the membranes here. You can see the changing in the knit structure to be able to create this three-dimensionality of the membrane. So a little bit like an arch, or sorry, a space beam, no? That you have the three-dimensionality of the space beam creates the structural strength. In the same way, we're using the knit structure to actually create the three-dimensionality to therefore gain the structural performance of each membrane. What we are doing is we are shifting between, it's a Jacquard knit, and what we're doing is we're shifting in the knit pattern so we can extend the material by 100%, so we can create the three-dimensionality of each program. Then we have worked a series of times with this. This is made in very stiff, so they're strong and stiff fibers, Serafil it's called, for the furniture industry. And what we're working with is that we have, so the material is stiff. It means that it cannot extend. And that means that all the performance of extension is happening only in the knit structure, which means that we can simulate it. And when we can simulate it, we can control it. Because we're working with the furniture structure, furniture fibers, then they also come in beautiful color palettes, and we got the factories to dye all these amazing colors for us, so that we could really also use the membranes to get this sort of very expressive colors. So you can see here that they are all controlled. We create these interfaces between the way that we are knitting and the way that we are steering the actual production, the actual structural performance. So steering the material at microscale and understanding the structure at macroscale. We've done a lot of projects of optimization, and Zoerotia is quite specific because it's on knit, but I think it's a good sort of pointer to the way that I don't think that the idea of optimization is wrong. I just think it's part of a larger vocabulary that we need to establish. And a second part of that vocabulary is obviously cascading, coming from circular design principles. And I wanted to show this very small project we did together with Maria Spara-Petersen, who is a glass artist, where we looked at 3D printing recycled glass powder from the recycling industry into a new set of material panels. So what we're doing is we're creating a paste, so quite similar to what we're doing in studio here, but instead of it being biomaterials, then we're working with these silicate materials. And obviously, working with a waste stream logic, we know that we have enormous amounts of glass recycling, and we have very different. US and Sweden, a quite big difference in how much of this glass is actually recycled. We took point of departure in other traditions of understanding glass as a novel material, looking at the idea of glass panels as not as translucent but not transparent, and then developing a 3D printing process where we were able to mix the glass dust coming from the washing of bottles. In Denmark, all the bottles are recycled, and so they wash them all, and when they do that, there's grinding of the bottles and it goes into waste. And we received, they don't know what to do with this waste, so we received a ton of it. And we mixed it, and we actually mixed it with baking powder as a binder, which allowed us to extrude it as a paste. And then when we do that, we get this sort of thick mass. We can steer the rheology of it, and we can fire it. I think maybe I can hop a little bit. Oh. No, anyway. So we can then fire it at about 940 degrees. And when we do that, we transform the material. So it goes from being vitrified, it has a stable structure, to being de-vitrified, which means we return it to silica, which is really interesting, I think. It also makes it non-translucent. And creates this sort of very, a little bit fragile panel that we're working with. It also had a really interesting artifact. The bottles that had been washed were mainly beer bottles. Beer bottles have yeast inside of them. Yeast and flour means that the material would raise like a bread, which created this very interesting porosity of the material, which we were trying to kill because we thought we should not have it. So we would microwave the glass, and we would, do anything to kill this. I learned when you bake bread, you're always worried about the yeast dying, but it is nearly unkillable when you want it to die here. Then when we were burning it or firing it, we were firing it at night. There's a schedule of the workshops, and only after 3 weeks of doing this every night, we realized that the whole workshop was black with soot at 3 o'clock in the morning. So we accidentally did the wrong timing one time, and so all this flour is being burnt out of the material. So anyway, small material discoveries. I think it's a very small project, but it is also a project that I really love, and I feel that there's so many more things that we could do with it, creating, also steering the actual structures of the material. So the last paradigm I wanted to talk about is grow. So how do we use bio-based materials? In CITA, we work with the idea of bio-based materials in a huge, in many different projects, and they are very complementary, but also have sort of each their own trajectory. One of the key projects that Winke also introduced is the ERC project, Eco-Metabolistic Architecture, which is a big deal for us because it's a very specific and very high-end research council, which really looks to boundary-pushing architecture. And what we're looking at there is trying to understand how we could create a sort of holistic ecological model that allows us to think about what are the necessary ways of understanding bio-based materials to work with them in architecture. And here we sort of created a sort of three-part perspective: the harvested, the designed, and the living, as a way of sort of navigating different processes of materials. And I'll just go through them. I'm hoping I'm okay for time. Am I a bit? Yeah, it's all good? Good. And then if you just blink at me, then I will know to stop. So if we sort of go through it a little bit linearly, then you could say, well, harvested materials, obviously we are very aware of harvested materials. We have many different kinds of harvested materials, obviously timber being most known or most sort of prevalent harvested material, but also other processes such as hemp or bamboo or others, and perhaps also other not so known material practices such as rubber. I found it very interesting to know that all the truck tires, they can't use synthetic rubbers. They need to actually use real rubber for them to have that strength. So there are loads of planted. You think about all the trucks in the world. So I thought it's an interesting thing. There are actually around us all these processes of harvesting that are not only sort of like agricultural, silvicultural processes. And of course, this has been theorized across different kinds of eras and also different kinds of contexts as either quite high-tech or low-tech practices. over the last 10 years, maybe, we have seen a huge renewed interest into specifically timber construction as one of the few ecologically sound building materials that are truly renewable, recyclable, and energy efficient. And of course, we are always being taught that this is an ability to work with the built environment as a carbon sink. But I think with this comes a lot of questions. So we know materials that forests, they don't store as much CO2 when they are young, and we also know the timber industry to be extremely wasteful. Here, if we take just the example of complex-shaped glulam, which is probably the most wasteful timber construct you can do, here, example from Shigurban, we can see that just even when you cut the trees, we get about 50% byproduct. Then we plane and cut 20%. When we straighten the glulam planing, we forgot the percentage. And then when we then cut out these shapes, we can get up to 50 to 70% byproduct. So it's just really wasteful. Of course, it's not like it's waste. It becomes downcycled into other products, a lot of it into pulp, and a lot of it into energy. But so what we were considering, let me get that moving, is I'm amazed that 30 years later it's still impossible to embed a video into PowerPoint, but anyway, it is beautiful, it moves. It doesn't say anything specifically, but to return to think about the forest and to be able to build sensitivity. So right now when we build with architecture and timber, we don't have any awareness of the forest, the impact on the forest, what forest, where. We have no way of connecting into that. So what we are interested in is trying to understand what are the political, social correlations to forest and ecology. There it came. So we have been doing a project together with Umeå Kommune, a municipality up in northern Sweden, where we're looking at one specific sawmill and trying to understand the territory of this sawmill and how much timber is actually being felled and produced at any moment of time. So it's something like 2,000 trees are being processed in this sawmill every single day, and it only takes timber from about 100 kilometers in diameter, because the trucks don't drive further than that. Then you just have a network. So for me, I cannot understand how you can fell 2,000 trees a day for me, the math doesn't make sense. And of course, what happens right now is that you have a push mechanism. You're pushing the timber into the mill. It means that with whatever the market demand is at that very moment of time, if it's toilet paper, then the trees will be made into toilet paper. And it is just such a depressing future. But of course, I think it's about 50% of the timber in this area is going straight to pulp. And as we get more and more interest into timber made out of timber-based architecture, in the southern Sweden, we have a city called Malmö, which is wanting to, by 2030, to construct everything out of, or to have a CO2 positive building. Like anything built by the state has to be CO2 positive, and the only way to do that is to build in timber. So it just necessitates a complete other order of how much more material we need. They're very happy about this in northern Sweden. They're earning a lot of money, but in the sort of the circular argument for this, then we need to be able to build sensitivity and understand what our design decisions are doing onto the ecologies around us. So what we're trying to do is even just understand the problem rather than trying to answer it right now. And as you know, of course, timber is a heterogeneous resource. There's, it is formed by its environment. There are knots in it, there are cracks, there is hardening, you have very different densities in the material. And the way that we now understand that is a series of classifications. So we classify the materials that come out of the sawmill. What we've been looking at in this project called RawLam is trying to understand how we could build new interfaces to be able to widen the amount of resource that's going into the built environment and to use lesser qualities of timber in structural beams. This is, of course, happening in an industry point of view also in industrialized elements, glulam elements. But here what we're trying to do is to design integrated to make interfaces that allow us to understand what qualities and so directly as we're designing, we can understand what qualities we're doing and the impact on resource. Our collaborator is the Italian company Microtech, which has created a CT scanner for timber. These are being sold. I mean, they're still pretty cutting edge, but in the sawmills in northern Sweden, there we were working with, they own them. And they create, it's a little bit like for your brain when you go to the doctor, but what we're seeing is, of course, very low-res imagery. So they do it at very, very high speed to optimize the actual cutting. What we're doing then is to try to create a material map and to steer that map and design integrated so we can set from our structural elements, we can understand what kind of material performance we want, and then map material qualities directly to that model. And so we get also interesting artifact. We can use wane, which the parts of the timber where we have bark in the middle of the beam, where we don't need so much structural performance. We need the structural performance on the outsides and around joints, and we can place the materials the varied materials in a quite steered manner, so a little bit the same paradigm of material grading, but here with a found resource rather than a designed. So I want to show a few, is it okay? Yeah, good. So if we come now to the designed materials, then we could say, okay, well, what the design, if we look at biopolymers as a class of materials, then we could say, well, they have, if we have worked with timber as a society, there are examples of timber construction that date more than 10,000 years, and timber constructions can last for 1,000 years themselves, then the design paradigm, the idea of thinking about materials as being designed is more a sort of 20th century idea coming with all the oil or fossil fuel-based materials. Biopolymers are part of this realm, and they are also something which was invented. They are contemporary with the invention of fossil fuel polymers, but they are much more unstable. So this is why that we work much more, or that we have the fossil fuel biopolymers are much more prolific in our societies now. In Radicant, which is the project we built for the EDIS gallery, we look at how to work with biopolymers. This was also what we were showing at the Acadia conference with another recipe than this, and what we're doing in the studio to really try to understand how we can 3D print with biopolymers and thereby steer the material to be able to create these architectural propositions. So we are asking simultaneously, what are the languages, what are the forming practices, what are the modelings, what are the characterizations, and how do we steer the way we are producing these materials, the way we are understanding their recipes and steering their recipes to be able to create a graded material practice and then be able to implement them into these 3D printed panels. The exhibition that we were part of, which I think is being taken down today, so it's unfortunate, but was a project called Living Prototypes, which we developed together with Christine and Hans-Jürgen from the AEDES Gallery, where we were together with ICD from Stuttgart and IAC in Barcelona, and then our work is the large screen and the Radicant project. What we're doing here is really trying to understand not just a sort of monomaterial structure built in one particular material system, but just to start probing how could these agendas of bio-based, silicate-based materials be brought together. So here we're seeing earth printing from IAC, and the filament winding using, I believe it's hemp or viscose, I forget, from ICD, and then our 3D printing with biopolymers. So what we're looking at here is really to try to understand how we could be working with materials from a sort of recipe point of view, that we were very inspired by the idea or by the fact that there's, if you look on the web, then you can find a whole array of how to make your own bioplastic. We started very, very simply by, in the lunch breaks, me and one of the research assistants would just decide we would make materials in the lunch break. So we were just mixing little things and trying to see them, and then making little rheology tests and trying to learn how to actually steer by going through this sort of open access recipe sharing community that there is online. When we look at what a biopolymer is, well, when we have different components that need to be joined together, and this is why it has this very sort of open versatility, because we can really steer the recipe and try to find our own recipes. We're now working with the DTU, which is the Danish Technological University, with the biopolymer group there, where we are characterizing these materials and finding out ways of being able to create a sort of matrix by which we can understand the recipe building. Also, biopolymers is a really, really large and slightly confusing topic, because we're often sort of associated with biodegradability, but a lot of biopolymers are not. And when they are biodegradable under very certain circumstances. They need to be biodegraded in soil often. There are particular enzymes that mean that they're biodegradable, and they can, for instance, not biodegrade in water. And we know that where all the plastic waste goes is into our water streams as we come from peak to river and to ocean. So I don't think it's not the sort of, hallelujah, here we found the solution, but more it's a sort of a way to start probing, okay, here's a class of materials we can work with. The materials we are developing are fully biodegradable, but they are also highly unstable. So the material recipes we're looking with right now in our studio also, we know we can make things that are stable in interiors, but we also are curious to how they develop new fragilities and sort of durabilities that we need to design for and with. So by varying the recipe, we can get very different material properties. Here in the Radicant exhibition piece, we are working with collagen glues, bone glue from cow. It's really smelly and it dries. When it dries, it doesn't smell anymore, but it means that it has this sort of brittle thing. It's sort of connected to the way that you might make a comb or like a, what's it called, to hold your hair? Hair clip, and so traditional ways of working with that. So so it has that sort of quality. We have been very seduced by the way that when we are mixing with bark, it gets this sort of slightly licoricey look. And then developing our own grading strategies and understanding how the layering of these mechanisms can be brought together to quite carefully and very orchestratedly understand how the things are actually joined together, interwoven, to create highly graded but also differentiated panels. And what are the principles by which we can then steer that? How do we need to model if we're not just modeling the geometry of something, but we're also modeling the material of something? So this is sort of fresh out of the oven. It's exciting for us to show. But just to finish, then maybe also to say that, of course, it's not like we will never see a piece of concrete or steel again. I think very interested in sort of dirty hybrids or intertwining things. This is a project which we did also with DTU. It's actually a student project by Adrian Brun, where he made this sort of 3D printed concrete and then used mycelium to grow or grew mycelium as an insulation material in the middle of the structure. So, I mean, there's definitely questions of sustainability going on there, but I think it's also about probing and trying to find new ways of using materials. We're doing a lot of work on mycelium, especially led by Phil Ayres, who is professor in CITA, looking at how to functionalize and again how to steer how the way that we are working, our different foodstuffs from mycelium can drive different properties and performances. Here also student work looking at new forming processes. So when I think this is just super inspiring, I feel like when I walk around in CITA, I will see weird machines like this appear. I don't really know what it's doing, some sort of spraying mechanism, or spraying with collagen, or wonderful furry elements. I found this fantastic algae somebody had fished out of a lake that they were grinding and making into materials. Here, Svenja, who's doing a postdoc with us, she's looking at interspecies cohabitation in these sort of textile earth structures that are also fired. So I think it is sort of driving a whole set of new questions that we're asking, and not always, it's very sort of allowing new ways of looking and new ways of asking for the way that architecture can be understood. So, yeah, thank you so much.
Are you okay answering some questions?
Yes, of course.
Any questions?
No, it's okay. Thank you for an absolutely amazing talk. How many research projects at a given time would you say are going on in CITA?
Yeah, I think, I don't know really, maybe we're doing maybe 12 or something like that right now, but they scale very differently. I think as a group, what is always a very interesting experience is the sort of feeling of going, you'll win a big grant, you'll do a big grant, you're a lot of people, and then you have this moment where the grant's finishing, you need to find the next one. So this sort of upping and downing also of the amount of people that we are is of course really fun when you have big projects, you're a lot of people, everything moves much faster. But I'm learning to also like the other periods of time where you have more time to wonder and develop sort of probes that can start creating the problems that we have. And then the other factor in CITA is, I think, maybe in the US also, I know that in certain parts in Germany and Switzerland, the groups are made around one professor. So you have one professor and their PhD students and research students. But in our realm, then we are many senior scientists working together, and it's more like a colloquium. So it's a little bit like steering cats now. People are moving in each their direction, and if you want coherence, then you have to let that happen. But at the same time, we can't be anything for anyone. So we're not a work colloque. We are a group and we have a vision, but how do you establish that vision? So I think that sort of I really enjoy it, because it's really fun to work with people who are very senior and have, a lot of maturity in their research.
Yeah. Yeah, sorry, I have one more question. We tried here when we got our robotics lab to also introduce a course in second year, so in a normal architecture education, and thank you also for teaching in that, in third year. So to kind of try and make it maybe part of education or part of general architecture education, to learn to think in robotics and material ecologies and new ways of fabrication. Are you and all your colleagues also all involved in teaching in robotics in the architecture education?
Yeah, so we have a master's program. So we have a dedicated master's program, but it's more like a unit system, like in the Bartlett. Now we have the master's level is subdivided into different subjects, and we have a specific subject on computation. So and so therefore we're all involved in teaching, and I think it's really crucial, because it's a way of sharing. So it's not only a way of teaching and disseminating, but it's also a way of having an ongoing discussion with your colleagues about what's important, why are you doing it. One of the key things I feel in our studio is using simulation, like developing your own bespoke, sometimes slightly mysterious simulations to be able to understand material behavior. So I had a student a couple of years ago who created these sort of her own ray tracing algorithms, and so she could sort of understand the steering of light through fiber optics. And so she was calculating all of this, and I think it's really wonderful when you see students understand that simulation is not a package that you download and implement. Simulation is a way of understanding how you're representing. So I think it's just such an enjoyment to have that, and to talk around the students. And then we do a lot of research-based teaching, a lot of workshops. And I think also there, where's the precision of research? Is it you've done a project and now it's all perfect, and then you let the students work on it, to ask new questions, to think differently about what you were doing? Or is it, I have this sort of strange idea and maybe it would work, and let's do it together and use the fact that we're teaching to learn with the students as we're doing. I think it's both and. So we work very much at both ends of this, and sort of meeting each other around that.
Great.
Thanks, Mette. It's a great lecture. I have a question about optimization and access, because, in a lot of work that goes into material studies, like we've seen today, they're of course driven by the sort of ecology of optimization, and you spoke about that early on. But then you also show examples at the very end, for instance, when you were saying, I'm walking through the studios and I see this hairy thing and this. And a lot of the material effects that I find super interesting when I look at the examples are the ones that seem to come through overdrive, or maybe sort of an excessive expression. And I was just wondering, is that true? And if that is true, where do you balance the sort of need for optimization with the pleasure or the desire for a more excessive expression of the materials you're dealing with and developing?
Yeah. I think it's a really good question. I don't know if the binary is between optimization and expression. I don't know if it's those two things that are at each end, but obviously you could take this as an engineering question, and you could say, I now want to find out how can I use this material in the most optimal way. I don't even know if that's a binary, but you could sort of reduce it to optimization. Of course, we are always wondering what's the architectural consequence of these languages, of these processes, and what kind of poetics or language does it then entail. And of course, we are very interested in probing that to find out, well, these are the differences it makes, not only to the way that we can, maybe the language of something, but also to what it can then entail, what kind of boundary can it make, what kind of new way of understanding inside and outside, or relationships between acoustics or so on. But all of that, so all that language that comes with a particular material process, we're very engaged with. I often get asked, what's the form of all that? What's the formal language? Do you have a formal language which drives all of this? I would say, first of all, it's not one authorship. There's a lot of people involved. There are the projects here that I have not been involved in. There are other projects where I got my paws really deeply dug in. But I think we share an understanding that we need to ask architectural questions of the material systems and the technologies we ask. Otherwise, this could exist in an engineering school. And we want to retain our role within an architectural school. Yeah, so I don't know if it completely answers, but it maybe answers in the way that we are very curious to what kind of opportunities it gains for architecture. I don't think it's necessarily like that it means that it's not optimal. Maybe what I'm trying to say is that we have in our field, there's maybe sort of a pinnacle or an idea, a one-liner that I think many people are getting suspicious of right now, which is that these processes, computational design, is sustainable because it optimizes. I think that logic is being unpicked, and that we're looking at many different ways of thinking about that. And I think questions of circular design, questions of waste stream, questions of material making, maybe it's better to make something that's really fat and chunky rather than slender and fine if it's made out of material that is abundant. So the logics of the underpinning of computational design is changing, I think. Yeah? Or do you want the microphone, maybe? Yeah.
Hi, thank you for your talk. This is really great. Something that struck me at the beginning of your talk was this kind of allusion you made to uncertainty as a skill, and thinking also about, you mentioned destabilization, and there's something, kind of paradoxical of the way you're going about things, which is kind of empowering through humbling and kind of decentering of the role of the architect, which I think is a really powerful, as you said, paradigm shift. And I'm wondering how that trickles down into the way you teach and the way you think about architectural education, kind of from the onset.
Excellent question. I think it's spot on, because I think it also points at the schizophrenia in myself and in the presentation, though, because I think we're aware that we need to work with ideas of fragility. We need to work with ideas of communication rather than control and steering. But at the same time, design is an act of steering. No, it is an act of implementing a vision and finding and deciding how you're going to do something. I think what we're trying to do with all these feedback loops and so on is to be able to listen to the way that the materials are behaving, to be able to understand, to be able to incorporate material behavior into the steering systems. But at the same time, all of these work processes that I'm showing are all about trying to gain control. When we start working in a bio-based material paradigm, then especially with these symbiotic systems where we're working with other organisms and so on, then of course that challenges that sort of complete authorship. So I think I'm not sure that what I'm showing is really doing what you were talking about, but we're very interested in getting to that point. No? So how do you make a design process that somehow is porous and somehow allows the context of the build to become present? And this is also what context? No, but there are many different dimensions of that: material behavior, other organisms, people. I don't know. You know, how did it? I think the consequence of the thinking becomes very large. No?
Thanks for the excellent lecture, Mette. I just want to go back to the UN slides you were showing at the beginning. So you mentioned, the architecture has all these kind of things that can add value to society, help address a lot of the problems the UN has kind of listed, and you have that kind of all the icons of all these different problems. And then you talked about and also in Winker's introduction too, about how you're exploring the expansion of design agency through interdisciplinary research. Your work touches on all kinds of topics, from material composites, biopolymers, and through to production processes. Computational methods are heavily aligned to material systems. So it's super interdisciplinary work. And I guess the question is, how can you actually argue with the UN for the role of architecture when it's very easy for the UN to turn around and say to categorize all the aspects of your interdisciplinary work? And this is a problem we all have. It's not just you, but if you've solved it, I want to hear the answer. But it's kind of like, if you've done something that's novel and valuable for solving those problems, and it's interdisciplinary work, even if the agency for that work started from an architectural mindset and was developed primarily by architects, it's very easy for them to break it down into the established categories they have. They could turn around and say, well, that part of the idea was material science, rheology, this part was engineering. This is something that mechanical engineers should be doing in the timber factory. How do you maintain that architecture was the nexus for the development of that research and argue for that at, say, the UN level?
Yeah, I think it's a really, I think it's actually one of my central remits. I do a lot of advisory roles. Being a woman in technology, you get asked into many different kinds of parties, and many of these projects are interdisciplinary, and I think that very often interdisciplinary partners, the engineers or the roboticists or I don't know, all of these other, they're very verbal and very strong to say this is my part of the project. The architects are a little bit swimming around and doing the interfacing between a lot of ideas. And my point is always that we need to give the model, the idea of the interface and the place of joining all of this in the model to give it value. So in one of the projects I'm looking at there is I simply had forgotten that they were modeling. So we see the result. We understand here's a very important material system that this engineer person has been doing, and here's a thing. And then it looks like the architect just designed the thing. But the architect made all the models and all that workflow that enabled that thing to be happening, to create the knowledge out of it. So this idea of what is the architectural model, what is that steering that's going on, and to give that presence and to be much more vocal around the importance of representation, or I mean, in our world it would be modeling, but it can also be a bit bland, because modeling could be done by a lot of different people now, but architectural representations may be a better word. I don't think the person who would ask that question is necessarily the UN, though. I think it's a good question, but for the UN, I think it's a complete different blindness. I mean, it's I say in secret between only us. And I think maybe it's simply an ununderstanding for that, that all of the decisions about how we make our built environment, that somebody's taking those decisions, that those decisions can be formed and shaped and they can be done differently. And that I think the UN and other guiding governmental bodies around us are very, very blind to what architecture actually means. In Denmark, we had an architectural policy. I think about 8 years ago, the government decided that it needed an architectural policy which guided the way that they were building cities and expanding cities and so on. And I haven't seen any update to that since then. So I think it's maybe a lower level than the UN, but it's still something we need to argue for and to be much better at articulating our role in society, and maybe also expanding a little bit.
Thank you, Mette. That was amazing. Just to follow up on that, because I think it's a question for us, architects and educators. I mean, that we have no role. We design so many things, and yet we have no power in a way. So I found fascinating that video that played out about how we use timber, and I thought that we are, that the message in a way that we use with our interface, with our dialogue, and the way that we work is kind of create awareness of where things are coming from. So if you look at everything that has to do with food. Now you have farm to table. You have an awareness where the apple comes, whether it's organic or it's not organic, where it's true cotton, fair trade for coffee. I mean, there's an awareness now of where things are coming from, and yet in architecture, everything comes from Home Depot. No, like it used to be that for a chef, things come from supermarket. So. But now, no, things are coming from certain farms, certain things are coming from, in wine, it's even like how many acres. The best wine is like just, 1 acre. The recognition of terroir. And in architecture, like you can say that for a lot of things, but in architecture, only if it's like a special material that you're bringing somewhere. But the idea that if you want to use timber construction, you would know where the tree is coming from, how it was treated, if it was fair trade, that everything that it was not used from the tree was pulp, that it was created for furniture or like something. And so the video that you shown in black and white, it's a beautiful, so maybe our role is to educate UN, government, architects, large corporations, into where things are coming from. I mean, I thought that was fantastic, like the difference between the different biopolymers is not the same. So why cannot we or discipline be similar to the other important disciplines that feed people? We house people. So why cannot, we have such an important role, like, that our food industry has. And so it seems that, we're somehow relegated to the designers, but we actually could be in charge of the whole line of production. So I thought that your lecture, what I bring upon is that this awareness is not a minor thing. It's, such an important element.
It's very emergent, all of that for us. It's very sort of new ground. So I don't think we have a particularly, I don't know if we have a big contribution to give to it. We're just trying to figure out how to navigate that. Of course, with legislation and certification, there are certificates which help us to understand what kind of timber is what, different kinds of timber, different methods of production and so on. But they're not localized, as I know them. but what we were interested in, the sort of our inroad, was that we did a series of chats, I guess it's called, with interdisciplinary colleagues coming from the timber industry, where we talked with a company called Tree Metrics in Ireland, who had been working with the European Space Agency to use satellite imagery to be able to map forests, to be able to map resource. And they also go out into forests with just normal 3D scanners and scan the wood, to really all in order to increase the value of what you're cutting. So when you're cutting a tree, you cut it to the size of the truck, and where you place that cut can make that resource like a lot worth or a little worth. And so normally it's a guy, he kind of knows cut there. But now they have a lot of, like all the felling machines have a huge amount of data. They're really high tech, all the machines. They drive around in trucks with displays all over them. So we were just nerdy and interested in the information chain. So we were thinking, okay, there's a lot of people who know something about the soils in the forest. There's these trucks that go around, they know a lot about. They are gathering data as they're driving around in the forest and felling. There are very particular patterns of how you fell. Then you have all the satellite data that you could bring together. Then you have the CT data. And all of this data is simply lost, like always in our digital change, that we have these break-offs and we just lose it. And then we end up with a very sort of benign material. But what would happen if we could join that? We haven't found a way of joining it yet. but we are sort of trying to find out what kind of information chains are more useful for us. What are more sort of low-hanging fruits? What can we actually work with? The CT scans are obviously, they're very informative. But what we're trying to go is going down the path and sort of meet, also forest is not just a carpet of trees. No, the soil conditions are really really distributed, and a lot can have very good trees over there and very bad, like you were saying about wino, that it's a very, very varied material, and also environmentally varied. No? So yeah, so I feel that I feel like it's a really interesting question. I don't feel that we have an answer yet.
Well, what I love about this discussion is I was thinking the AIA conference. Remember that? So if you go to the AIA conference or the AIA fair or whatever, they have a building fair. And then what you get is Marvin Windows and who makes really cheap doors, whatever. Anyway, it is, when I was listening to both of you, I thought AIA is here our union of architects, right? And I was thinking there is a massive gap between what we're discussing here and even what is happening in reality in factories, which are actually probably, more informed on all the things you are researching and explaining beautifully. But I think what is the real scary part is that the organization in the US that is representing us is actually, I think, completely unaware of any of this. So if you go to their fair, it's literally every stand, it's Home Depot. And when you said Home Depot, I was thinking AIA, that kind of thing. And that is actually a shocker. So the reason why we here at Weitzman Architecture trying to bring research to architecture is exactly that reason. Because for our students, you guys are only going to make it if you do research and take that power back. And the other task we're all going to have is change the AIA or decapitate it and start anew. But something, right? Because it's very interesting. There is, in our own profession, a massive gap. And that's almost the saddest part, right? Like that Home Depot is the AIA. And that is a real thing. So on that note, I think we should go and have drinks. Because there is a future. But thank you so much. Let's give Mette a warm applause.